Next up, we have our panel on healthcare. We've got Eileen Applebaum is a co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Phil Longman is managing editor and policy director at Open Markets Institute. Catherine, Artizone, counsel with Knowledge Ecology International, and Alex Lawson is executive director of Social Security Works. And I thought I'd kick off the panel. I mean, theme one here is like, what is the problem in this market? What are the problems? I mean, I know this is a really big market. I think each of you comes with a little bit of a different expertise. I'd love for each of you to kind of just talk about like, a major problem in the healthcare market, and then we'll follow that up with a conversation about solutions.
Okay. Should I go for it?
Yeah, Eileen, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah.
Well, there's so many problems in this market, and I'm sure many people will be discussing them, but I'd just like to focus some of the attention on the financialization of the healthcare industry, the healthcare sector, hospital CEOs being paid as if they were running financial corporations, and the reason they're being paid that way is they are running financial corporations. Everybody knows that hospital margins are very narrow, and yet if you look at the profitability of some of our really big successful hospitals like the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, you see that their overall profit margin, not their operating margin, that's narrow, but their profit margin is very large. You probably do not know that UPMC has its own venture capital arm. So you have to ask yourself what business that hospital system is in. And so I just would like to emphasize the fact that when we think about reforming healthcare, we focus on the insurance companies. In my view, that's just one piece of the problem. So Linda this morning pointed to private equity and hedge funds. In hospitals, it's mostly private equity. Not that they own hospitals, because they discovered, except for HCA, which made its money in many ways that are not savory. But anyway, the other private equity companies that bought hospitals have not made money. In fact, they're failing. I put together a little PowerPoint, not that I thought I was going to give a PowerPoint, but everybody talks about how hard this is to understand, and I wanted to have something that you could pick up, or it's easier to see on the screen if anybody who wants it can sign up and have it sent to them. You would be able to see that the private equity quickly learned they can't make money in hospitals. They don't want to be anywhere where CMS can set the terms of what they're going to make. And so what they want to do now is they want to provide services that are that hospitals or healthcare systems are contractually obligated to pay for, so that they can escape that. They want to build power nationally, and the main point of what is in my little PowerPoint is that the model in healthcare is a little bit different than Toys R Us. What they do is they buy up so you have Envision, which I think you all have heard about, the Surprise Medical Building. It's been in the press a lot. That's an example, if you want, of how people can rise up, speak to their folks in Congress and say, you have to do something about this. I went to the emergency room. It was in my network. I got there. I didn't have any choice about which doctor was going to take care of me. When I left, I thought everything was taken care of because I'm an insured person. I have really good health insurance. And then I get a surprise medical bill because the emergency room has been outsourced to a physician staffing firm owned either by Envision, which has, by the way, 60,000 medical professionals in hospitals all over this country, or to Team Health. Blackstone, Envision owned by KKR, Team Health owned by Blackstone has another 20,000. So with 80,000 of these professionals in emergency rooms, anesthesiology, radiology, all the places you go into a hospital and you don't pick the doctor, you're likely, you or a member of your family or a friend or neighbor is likely to have run into them. And so what they do is they buy a company to be a platform. They buy up doctors' practices. They keep adding on, adding on, adding on. They fall below the radar for antitrust because they don't meet the threshold for review, because how much can a doctor's practice be worth? Anything under, I don't have the exact number at the moment, but around $90 million, anything under that doesn't even get antitrust review. And so they build national powerhouses, which then either in the case of Envision, can just bill you. They go out of network. Their doctors are not in any insurance networks, and so they just bill you. Or if you're Team Health, they have the opposite way of doing it. They threaten to go out of network as long as you have the possibility that you can threaten to go out of network, because who's the patient mad at? They're mad at their insurance company. I paid you all that money. You have all my premiums. I had to be taken care of, and you're not paying. So we almost passed the bill. In the beginning, everybody knew it was Envision and Team Health. Nobody understood that KKR owned Envision and that Blackstone owned Team Health, that they have loaded these companies up with debt, that their business model depends on the out-of-network pricing, that if they can't get the out-of-network pricing, they are going to default on. So Envision is the 15th most widely held collateralized loan in portfolios all over the country. Not in your portfolio because it's not investment grade, but banks, insurance companies, foundations, endowments, union pension plans. It's the 15th most widely held loan of that kind. And that's because everybody expects that Envision will do well. KKR knows what they're doing. They never default. And then some of us went public with what was really behind it, that it was private equity. And then the anger in Congress really multiplied because it had been framed to Congress as your doctor saved your life and your insurance company doesn't want to pay for it. But once they understood that what was behind it is a private equity business model that depends on people being charged this way, the anger was palpable. The debt markets got scared. Envision, which has always traded at the debt trades at 94, 95, 98 cents on the dollar, fell below 80 cents on the dollar after this all became public. And that is distressed debt territory. Team Health's debt was trading in the 70s. Not good for them. They knew what was happening. We get the dark money campaign. They defeat the legislation. We almost won it at the very end, and then it got defeated again, but may come back. I'll stop with this one, but I just want to say, yes, we can stop this one with legislation, but if I get a second round, I'll tell you why we need regulatory reform, or we need the FTC to take a better look at this.
Phil, I think there's a good transition here to concentrate on hospital markets.
Right. Well, I think Eileen and I are looking at this question much the same way.
Okay.
And for me, it's kind of a journey to get to the understanding that I think I have now about what the real order of battle is in healthcare reform. As you say, most people think that problem with our healthcare system, it's the finest in the world, except evil insurance companies keep getting in the way of me and my doctor doing all this great stuff, right? And that is very largely misframed. Here's how the scales fell from my eyes, in part. Some years ago, I wrote a book about VA healthcare called Best Care Anywhere. I wrote a book that is true about the very high delivery quality of the VA healthcare, despite its reputation. Having written that book and gotten a lot of support from veterans organizations and others, friends of the VA, Bernie Sanders prevailed on Harry Reid to have me appointed to the special commission to look at the future of VA healthcare. This was starting in 2015. And when I got on that commission, the Republicans got a chance to put their people on, and the White House had their people on, and Senate Democrats had their people on, and so I was representing Bernie Sanders, and there were representatives literally from the Koch brothers on that commission. And so I thought the order of battle would be between sort of Koch brother-like libertarians who just wanted to strangle socialized health care in the bathtub versus, progressive people. Right? And what I came to find out is that's actually not the order of battle at all. The order of battle was big institutions, including some that the Obama administration had appointed to this commission, including the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, with its very benign academic nonprofit-sounding name, right, was there. Cleveland Clinic was represented on this panel. And those guys, I could deal with the Koch brother people. They were pussycats compared to these academic medical centers, because what they wanted was full privatization of the VA so they could gobble up the last remaining competitor in their markets for healthcare. University of Pittsburgh Medical Center has about 80% of the acute care beds in Pittsburgh, greater metropolitan area. The only other player left, basically, is the VA, and they want to kill VA. So that made me realize, right, who the villains are here, right? There's a lot of good people in medicine. Let's make that clear, right? But we're now talking about corporate medicine on a fantastic scale. And many of these institutions have very benign sounding names, like the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. It sounds like it's academic. It does have a nonprofit status, but it doesn't mean they don't have profits. They have tremendous profits. You can see their profits in the parking lot, where there's all kinds of very fancy cars parked. Because of this intense monopolization, corporatization of healthcare, we have to be really careful when it comes to a simple Medicare for all program, because if Medicare for all just means that the government writes a check to everybody to go to whatever hospital, right? That can come to resemble something like sole source Pentagon contracting if we're not careful. Because, for example, if you were a politician representing Western Pennsylvania, right, you can't explain to your voters how come they can't go to the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, right? Which means that in practical terms, you're going to have to be a price taker, not a price maker, right? And so we need, first of all, to do really important work on antitrust, breaking up these incredible concentrations, not only horizontally but vertically, because now we're in a world where not in most medical markets in the country now, not only have the last two remaining hospitals merged with one another, right, but they're now busy becoming insurance companies too. Like, for example, the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center is vertically integrated into insurance, and they bought up all the doctors' practices too, right? And now in pharmaceuticals, you're seeing, further down the supply chain, right, into the very drugstore, right? That kind of vertical integration is really dangerous if it isn't controlled. There is a clinical case for this kind of integration. One of the biggest problems in healthcare in the United States clinically is that it's very fragmented. We all go to different specialists who treat one body part at a time. They don't coordinate with each other. They don't work on a common record. In many ways, healthcare wants to be big, but it can't be big and monopolistic unless we're going to treat it as something like a utility. Which brings me to my last point, which, where I have finally landed on this, is not only do we need a great deal of antitrust enforcement, but we also need to attack the problem of price discrimination within healthcare. That's another way of talking about what surprise billing is, right? It's rampant price discrimination. So we live in a world where two patients are in the same hospital room with the same condition, being treated by the same doctor, right? And one of them is paying 300 times what the other one is, right? And what does that price differential reflect? Does it reflect the cost of care for these respective patients? Not at all. It reflects the comparative market power of themselves and their health insurers or employers, right, in negotiating prices at a backroom table, right? Because that's how prices are set now in healthcare, right? They're set because payers of healthcare, typically insurance companies, come into these monopolized provider markets, and they said, "Could we please have you in would you please be part of our network?" Right? And they say, well, like the soup Nazi on Seinfeld, right? No soup for you unless you pay our price. That's the dynamic that's under it. And there's hardly any conversation about it. My simple solution to this problem is just to say, let's have Medicare prices for all. We have an elaborate process, rational process, evidence-based process for setting Medicare rates. It's not perfect. It tends to overcompensate specialists. There's other problems with it. But at the end of the day, it results in prices that are about 40% less than what most of us who have commercial health insurance have to pay for health care. What if we just had a rule that said no price discrimination in health care, right? Everybody pays the same price for the same service. Doesn't matter if you're with a big, powerful insurance company or a little insurance company, if you're uninsured, if you live in a monopolized market or a competitive market, doesn't matter, right? One price. That doesn't eliminate competition in healthcare. It shifts the terms of competition. It means all the biggest minds in healthcare are no longer focused on how can we shift costs and prices onto somebody else because the prices are all the same. Instead, the competition is who provides the best healthcare, right? So that's my.
And I want to come back to this because I know you've got a good example of how this is already playing out at a state level. Catherine, I know you're looking at a very different problem here. What's your take on, a problem in the healthcare space? And I know we're mixing in solutions and problems, so that's fine if you want to.
Well, my line of work focuses on the technology transfer process in the United States, which is when federal agencies spend tens of billions of dollars on investing in new drugs and biologics. And the principal statute that governs that process is the Bayh-Dole Act. And we see the problem as the failure of agencies such as the NIH, which invests $40 billion each year in this research and development, to protect the taxpayers' investment in these new technologies and to implement the Bayh-Dole Act in a way that's consistent with its text, legislative history, and policy objectives. And there are three specific problems that I'll talk about. One is the lack of transparency about the NIH's activities in general. We think that it's unreasonable and outrageous that even though the NIH invests $40 billion each year in biomedical research and development, which includes basic research and even some clinical trials, it's very non-transparent, or it's almost completely non-transparent about the costs of clinical trials. One of the main justifications, or the main justification for high drug prices in the United States, is the claim that it costs $2.6 billion to develop a new drug, which we think that there are flaws with that claim, but it's nearly impossible to contest that claim when there's non-transparency about what drug companies are spending on clinical trials, because it's based on that claim is based on proprietary research, and the information on what it's based hasn't been disclosed to the public. So we want to build a counter narrative, but there's an asymmetry of information that we're struggling to deal with. So we have requested information from the NIH about what are you spending on clinical trials? And they've said that they're unable to provide this information, that they don't have it. But there's an agency in California, the Center for Regenerative Medicine, that has a website where you can look at clinical trials funded by that agency and find out exactly what they cost. So we don't think that it should be impossible to provide this data, and that's one of the reforms that we think is very important. Another problem with the NIH is that there are very important inventions, including cell and gene therapies, that are being developed right now by NIH scientists at NIH laboratories. And then in the technology transfer process under the Bayh-Dole Act, the NIH looks for commercial partners to develop that technology to bring it to market so it can be sold to American patients. But there are limitations in the Bayh-Dole Act to the terms of those agreements in which the NIH licenses the technology to the private sector. Before giving what's effectively a monopoly in these license agreements, the NIH has to determine that no commercial partner would develop these technologies on a non-exclusive basis. And it has to limit the scope of the rights to that which is necessary to attract a commercial partner that's qualified to develop the product. But we found that when these licenses are being proposed and negotiated, they're always fully exclusive with the broadest possible rights. And the scope of the license that's most important, in our opinion, is the duration of the license. It's very important when giving what's effectively a monopoly in these technologies developed by taxpayers, taxpayer-funded scientists, that the monopoly is no longer in duration than absolutely necessary. But routinely, what we found is that the NIH grants these licenses for the life of patent, which is the longest possible term. In the past, they didn't do this. And there was a drug called cisplatin that the NIH licensed for shorter than the life of patent, and that to Bristol Myers Squibb. When it came up to extend the license and the NIH was negotiating with Bristol Myers Squibb, they were able to extract a concession that Bristol Myers Squibb would agree to fund $30 million towards cancer research. That was how important it was to get that extension. So it's very important that NIH technology transfer officers, when they're implementing these licensing decisions, do some kind of economic analysis and give meaningful consideration to the terms of these licenses. So they're not giving sweetheart deals to the pharmaceutical industry every time, but they exercise the leverage that this government has in funding the basic research, sometimes the clinical trials. These inventions sometimes have had promising results in clinical trials. They're not as risky as the NIH always portrays them to be. And so in situations where this is a very attractive investment, the scope of the licenses should be limited to reflect what the taxpayers have invested and the value of these inventions to people, so that we don't have these unnecessary overbroad monopolies, which will surely result in high prices, especially for life-saving technologies such as CAR therapies to cure cancer. And then the last thing I'll say is that there's just a failure to implement some of the safeguards built into the Bayh-Dole Act to protect the taxpayers' investment in medical research and development. And the biggest one that comes to mind is Marchin authority, which has never been exercised by the NIH because primarily the NIH is misinterpreting the authority for Marchin. One of the grounds for Marchin is when a drug company or other kind of licensee fails to make the product available to the public or fails to achieve practical application of the invention, which means failure to make it available to the public on reasonable terms. We have petitioned for Marchin with a drug called Xandy that costs $150,000, was developed with taxpayer funds, including a grant from the Department of Defense, and cost 2 to 4 times in the United States what it costs in other high-income countries. And so we think that's unreasonable. But in denying requests such as this, the NIH has stated that there hasn't been failure to achieve practical application because the drug is effectively being sold. So it's available to the public, and just deleting that portion of the text that says on reasonable terms. I mean, one of the most important terms that you can think of is the price at which the drug is available. And when there's failure to make a product available at a reasonable price, that hurts health outcomes. So we see that as a big issue as well.
I notice the word monopoly is being used a lot. So that's something I will come back to when we talk about solutions. But Alex, you're the closest one, the one tied to a campaign, a populist campaign. What's your view of the problem here?
Everything that was just said all mushed together into one thing with no priority given to one over the other. So pharma, hospital, insurance operate together as a triangle to just extract wealth from people. Now, we do say monopoly, 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 because that is what we're seeing. They're consolidating. But really, it's behind it is Wall Street. And they use the same play in all of these games. So like Xandy, for example. And first of all, everyone should sign on to KEI's request just for the humor that you get when you get the response from the NIH. It's literally the best thing ever. There's no way that we could ever say what a reasonable price is. And then Jamie's like, well, here's the criteria that lays out a reasonable price. It's just written down. Like, this is the WHO says it. We say, everyone has it. Here's how to do a reasonable price. And then NIH is like, oh, that's too difficult for us to do. It's very humorous, but not in a ha-ha way. And they're like, oh, man, this is why the system's so bad. And then we never note that with Collins, right, at NIH. So this guy's a patent holder. He's got 15 patents that he doesn't say whether he's making any money from it or not. I mean, and then go to the Office of Technology Transfer, which is my favorite part of the government that just gives away public resources. And I swear I can tie all 3 of them together, but it's the manner in which they operate is the same. So Office of Technology Transfer We pay for all the research and development. I think you're being way too polite for how much. We pay for the hardest part, the basic research, the riskiest part, basic research. But Aaron Kesselheim at Harvard just had a study that showed that we pay for a quarter of late-stage clinical trials, which means we pay for almost a quarter of drugs from start to finish. And then they go to this Office of Technology Transfer where some person who none of us have ever heard of just gives the patent. Sole source gives the patent to a company. Why? Well, I mean, I say corruption. But if you're going to give it to them, at least put like some restrictions, say at a reasonable price. Never. We can't do that. Then you get ex-ante. So what's very similar with the hospital case is that in that case, you have the UC system. So Berkeley, right? Or is it just UC?
UCLA.
UCLA made $1 billion off of this one drug. So whenever pharma has to defend the fact that people are dying because they can't get access to a drug that was developed with public dollars entirely. I said that, but I want to say it again. Entirely with public dollars, DOD, pharma doesn't usually come in and actually defend their own case because everyone hates them. They're actually more hated than the U.S. government. For the first time in 30 years, the U.S. government was not the most hated institution on Pew's list. Pharma is, and then the U.S. government. It's UC who comes out and defends it. Or in the hospital case, it's not the private equity. Everyone is like, well, that's terrible. An unconscious person goes to the emergency room after a car accident and they didn't pick the emergency doctor that was in network, so they get a $500,000 bill and have to go bankrupt. That's obviously terrible. And, you know, the Wall Street firms behind it, those are obviously villains. But they put forward a medical, what was the one that you said, university?
Pittsburgh Medical Center.
Pittsburgh Medical Center. They have a very like nice sounding front group for to sell it to people. And in pharma, again, they have disease groups. So they pump money into disease groups to go say, oh, of course, it would be better if everyone had access to this drug. But the thing is, we need innovation, even though the public does most of the innovation. My point is, all of them are driven by financialization. It's all Wall Street, private equity, hedge funds who are looking at the healthcare system as a whole, as a continuum, just the way it is, right? You can't get healthy without access to a doctor, a hospital, pharmaceuticals, right? Like in a person's life, you will touch the medical system probably on all of these. That's how Wall Street sees it. And they divide it up into these three big ones. I think insurance actually is the one that they divide up the least. They kind of let insurance take the hits the most, and they're like the obvious villains. But Wall Street actually loves having three entities that all point the finger at each other and say like, oh man, we would totally rather not charge you $500,000 for this hospital stay, but the drugs are so expensive, and what can we do about that? You know, and if they were, you would negotiate, right? Like if they were being honest. And then the insurers are like, oh, well, we would love to charge you real prices, but in fact, the insurance through the PBMs, they're the reason that we have to have these incredibly high list prices in the first place. And they just pass the buck in this triangle, just round and round. And in fact, they all profit as prices and costs go up because it all passes to us, to the consumers. So the point is, if you're addressing the healthcare system, which I refuse to call broken because it actually is like a well-oiled machine. It operates exactly as it's set up to do, but it doesn't operate to give healthcare. It's just to extract money from people using our health and our lives as the hostages to steal our money. But as long as they can have us fighting on the policy front, you know, to address this piece or that piece, and not the totality, then they just keep winning. And then to bring it to the surprise medical billing, I mean, they fought that thing with the exact same ferocity that they would fight an entire system change, right? I mean, there's actually ads in Iowa running right now about the Venezuela-style socialist takeover that is ending surprise medical billing. So the political case is also not there, that it's too heavy a lift to do all three of them at the same time, and we should only look at a small piece. In fact, we have to do all three of them at the same time. So, for example, the Medicare for All bill that both Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are on in the Senate, and if you mix in Pramila Jayapal's in the House, it does take on all of these, right? So you have global budgets which take on hospital. You actually, maybe we could spell that out a little bit more, but it definitely goes a long distance in addressing all the things that we brought up. It says, this is how much your hospital takes to provide care. This is what we're going to give you as your budget. You can't use that for profit. You can't use that for these other purposes. It's for providing care. We have one price for things because it is one system. So an MRI here is an MRI here, same price. Also one standard of care, so that because people get charged different amounts of money, but sort of worse in a moral sense is people also get different care, right? That's why they ask to see your insurance card first before they give you the care, because it actually matters what your insurer is to see what kind of care you get. And then we take on pharma in terms of using competitive licensing. On the back end of the Medicare for All bills is competitive licensing, saying that if you don't lower your prices, you can't walk away from the table, pharma, because we can actually allow generic competition. You will lose your patent, and we will allow other companies to produce that drug so that the patient is not put at risk. The patent is put at risk, which is a guiding principle of Jamie's and of the movement, is that when you're lowering prescription drug prices, you have to look at the patent, the cause. So my take is that a full, robust Medicare for All that we're talking about can only succeed if we take on all three at the exact same time. And we need to address the fact that the problem is financialization. It's Wall Street behind all of these, looking at them as ways to make money. You remove that from the equation in all three of them at the same time, and then you can build a system that actually provides health care, not just golden yachts for Wall Street billionaires.
I want to, we're actually running short on time, so I'll open up for questions momentarily. I want to bring it back to executive authority or, solutions, populist solutions to a lot of these things. I mean, legislation, obviously ideal, and that, that can be much more comprehensive. You can be a lot more creative. What are the executive tools in the toolbox? We've mentioned NIH, we've mentioned antitrust, what are the tools for each of these areas that would help address this from on day one, with executive authority to take on some of these problems?
So the Democrats the Democratic commissioners at the FTC clearly understand what the problem is, what the issues are. We need some kind of look back. If you start with a platform company and you begin to acquire these smaller companies, each of the individual purchases falls below the threshold for review. But there is some point at which you're building a national powerhouse that is going to be able to raise prices, that's going to have some effect on quality of care. I mean, the other example that's in the little handout is a hospital system called CHS, which at one point was the largest for-profit hospital system by number of hospitals. It doubled its size. It forget about buying all the little ones. It did that too. But at one point, it took on a company called Triad and doubled the number of hospitals to 130 with no pushback from the FTC. And then next time it took on a really big, now CHS is loaded with debt, acquires a struggling large for-profit hospital system, how that deal was ever allowed to go through. A third grader could have looked at that and said, oh, I don't think that's going to work out so well. One is loaded with debt and the other one is struggling. The one that's loaded with debt is going to take on even more debt to buy the one that is struggling. And for a minute, they were really big and successful. Share price went up, and within a year, this little house of cards began to collapse, and they began selling off hospitals. Well, they had started out by buying all these little hospitals. That's rural hospitals, suburban hospitals, small town hospitals. They spun off 38 hospitals into a for-profit system called Quorum. Small, rural, little hospitals, loaded it with $1 billion of debt. So CHS got the billion and Quorum got the debt. So you just think about this, a set of rural hospitals, 38 of them. It won't surprise you that within a year or so, they had already either shuttered or gotten rid of 11 of them. 84% of these hospitals were the sole acute care provider in their area. So we're not just talking about, not like, okay, Toys R Us was bad enough, but it's not like shuttering a toy store, right? And so, and they were able to do this. They were able to acquire these hospitals with no oversight. They were able to divest these hospitals with no oversight. I'm not really sure where the SEC fits into all of this, because they were publicly traded and they divested into a new corporation that they had themselves created that was also publicly traded. Who the heck is investing in these things? Who buys the shares of stock, I want to know? Who doesn't understand what private equity, who are the sophisticated people on Wall Street who don't understand what private equity does to hollow out the companies that they own, and then when they take them public, actually goes out and buys the stock? Who are the creditors that are lending money for this kind of thing? So, your Medicare prices for all, or the other proposals that have been indicated here that will rein in the price, you can just see that is going to destroy a lot of the Wall Street investment. You could just see it with the surprise medical bills. The minute it was clear that private equity was behind it and that this had infuriated Frank Pallone's committee, Lamar Alexander's committee, they were really mad about this and they were going to do something. You could see the debt on these companies, which is in the billions. You could just see it sinking in value, moving into distressed debt territory, making it really difficult if they want to borrow again for something like this. So that one price idea, reining in these prices, I think is going to be a really important part. Having the FTC, but talking about what they could do immediately, having the FTC adopt a rule where it can do a look back and not just say, oh, this little purchase is not that big. And having them do enforcement. I mean, when they bought Triad, they doubled the size to 130 hospitals. How can you do that without being asked to divest anything? So we need real enforcement at the FTC. We need new rules that allow them to do this kind of look back. There are many other things. People here will have many other things, but I think antitrust legislation and regulation, some way of getting at the one price, these are the things that are going to take the wind out of Wall Street's sails.
So we got antitrust rules, antitrust enforcement. Phil, maybe talk a little bit about, at the state level, or what you're seeing as an example of action on this Medicare price idea already.
Right. So state of Montana has done a really interesting thing where basically they took their state employee health care plan and they said to the hospitals in Montana, we'll pay you 2 times what Medicare pays, take it or leave it. And it was a big fight, but eventually the state employee unions and others came around because they looked at the hospital and said, 2 times Medicare is not good enough for you, right? And so that to me was a kind of proof of concept of how you could kind of flip this. I'm talking to people in California now who are very interested in trying this, not with just the employee pension fund in California, but with all payers in California, because they could do that, right? Maryland has a very interesting, they have a long tradition of regulating hospital prices. They've now combined that with global budgeting, right? And live to tell about it. And this is important because remember, Medicare for All program was attempted in Vermont in 2011, and it couldn't fly politically because you had to tell people 2 things. We're going to have to raise your taxes, and you're going to have to give up your current health care plan. And between those 2 things, became politically toxic in Vermont, right? Under Medicare price thing, you don't have to raise anybody's taxes, and you don't have to tell anybody they have to change their healthcare plan. You just say everybody gets about a 40% discount on their healthcare costs. And you can make it legislatively so that those savings are pushed back to the ultimate consumer, not kept by insurance companies or employers. So I think that although it's tough politics, right, because you're going right up against those providers and the financialization vultures behind them, right? You're not taking on all the people that want to pay higher taxes. You're not taking on unions that don't want to give up their health care plan, right? And you have a credible story about how you can really lower healthcare costs for the great mass of middle-class, middle-aged people that get their care from commercial insurance. And you don't even elements of the insurance industry are more than happy to compete on administered prices, because the smaller insurance companies they don't have a chance of competing against the bigger ones in this world we live in now. So anyway, I think it might work.
And Catherine, I remember we did some work on this last year that you can actually, that HHS, or I forget exactly who it is, can actually go in and say, hey, you're not providing this at a reasonable price.
Mm-hmm.
We are gonna take the drug, license someone else to make it, and you go to court, you can sue us for the royalties, and the judge will set a reasonable royalty rate. Is that how it works? I mean, is that, imagine a scenario, you're in charge of that agency, what's your step one, aside from firing that person with the patents and
Right. So you're referring to the Marchin authority, and which has never been used, but I think you interpret it correctly. And the way we interpret it is that the first grounds for Marchin is failure to make an invention available to the public on reasonable terms, which includes price. So the NIH has not interpreted it that way. They have found that as long as an invention is being sold and available, regardless of what price it's being charged for, then they can't march in. So there should be some kind of rulemaking to clarify. And they've also said that it's just too difficult to implement to determine when something's available on reasonable terms. So there could be some clarification and rulemaking that failure to make an invention available to the public on reasonable terms means at an unreasonable price. And KEI has set forth a proposal for how to determine when a price is unreasonable, because the NIH has said that this is, as Alex mentioned, the NIH has said, we don't know how to do this. This is beyond our competence. So the proposal that KEI has set forth that has been adopted in a directive to I think it was the 2018 NDAA Authorization Act, was when taxpayers funded an invention, that's the main criteria for Marchin, and the price is higher in the United States than in the 7 largest economies with a per capita income at least half that of the United States. Another reform that we think is very important that I mentioned before that the Secretary of HHS has the authority to do is to modify the online repository of clinical trial information called clinicaltrials.gov and add information about the cost of clinical trials that are funded or conducted by the NIH. Taxpayers funded these trials, were entitled to that information, and it should not be difficult to implement. We'd also like an online database of any patents that were involved that received federal funding. There should also be some rulemaking guidance or training to NIH technology transfer officers on how to negotiate licenses in federally owned inventions, as I also mentioned. They have to be limited to only what's necessary to induce the investment to get a company to want to take the drug or biologic and bring it to market. We've had correspondence and interactions with the NIH that show that their analysis that they're conducting right now is they think if this is an early stage cell or gene therapy, then you have to give away the broadest possible rights, which is a fully exclusive license for the life of patent. We think that can't be the case for every single cell or gene therapy. Some are more relatively advanced, some are very early stage, but there needs to be an individualized assessment of the value of the invention, its likelihood of success, and all of these things that an investor would consider when deciding to license a technology. So there's actually some meaningful consideration of these factors. So the way that they're analyzing it now has to be brought in line with the Bayh-Dole Act, and some rulemaking or training would help achieve that as well. And then another thing that we think is important is getting the NIH to police non-compliance with a requirement that anytime somebody receives NIH grants and develops an invention, they have to report the government's rights in the invention in the patent and patent application. And that requirement is extremely important, because how can the government exercise its rights in an invention, such as Marchin, or there's also a right to a royalty-free license that the government has to practice the invention throughout the world. But how can it exercise these rights and police what's going on if it doesn't even know that these rights exist in the first place? And we've seen numerous instances of noncompliance with this reporting requirement in very important drugs. And so one of the remedies, potential remedies for noncompliance, or penalties, I should say, is revoking the patent. But whatever the remedy is, there should be some policing of this. And we've petitioned on several instances the NIH to enforce this rule, and it's ignored all of our petitions.
Alex, you mentioned legislation. What do you think, via executive authority would be priority in this area?
So I think that there's an enormous amount that you can do with executive authority, especially in the realm of pharmaceuticals. So making it clear, Senator Elizabeth Warren has a government manufacturing bill on pharmaceuticals. And we need to have, now let me actually just back up and just say, basically everything is possible on day one if there is the political will to do it. All the communications with NIH are just based on like a political sense of where things are right now. We clearly have these authorities. The FTC, like a 4-year-old, could have figured out different mergers were clearly in violation of current law, except that where we are right now is the FTC does nothing, right? Like that's what they do. Their job is to never enforce antitrust ever, because something. So it's a system change, a change of focus on day one, to say, and we're going to come at this legislatively, but let me just make clear what I can do on day one and take a few heads along the way. These are all obviously my personal opinions, but also organizationally, Social Security Works signs off on all of these. We should take, and Elizabeth Warren has a lot of this in her package of executive orders in terms of pharmaceutical. They're in her Medicare transition plan. Just take patents away from some pharmaceutical companies. I think they should aim super high on that. Like, I think that they should take Humira, which is a drug that the profits from one drug actually make as much money as Southwest Airlines, the whole company, right? From one drug. Now it's got a patent thicket, so it's got hundreds of patents surrounding this thing to make sure that they can keep extracting maximum profits. All of them, just executive order all of them, while staring directly in the eyes at every other pharmaceutical company and being like, do you see what happens when you do this? That would be a change in the way we see things, right? NIH would get the message of that. NIH would start being like, oh yeah, we do have the ability to do an immense amount of things. In fact, instead of giving the maximum exclusivity every single time, we're going to give the minimum exclusivity every single time. Yes, you can bring this to market. You get 1 day of exclusivity. Prove to me that you need 1 day more than that. That kind of change of attitude from the top would be an immense thing. And very quickly, we would actually find that we have an enormous amount of power in the executive to go after a lot of the malfeasance in hospital, pharma especially, because they're like the poster child, and insurance.
We're out of time, but I'd love to take one question. I know, Rashad.
Yeah, I have a question on Medicare for all and politics on it. The question I want to know from the panelists is their assessment on whether Senator Elizabeth Warren is a sellout to the cause of Medicare for all, because she has had the recognition that if you put out a two-part plan, one that takes that if she were not able to pass it through the Senate or Congress or the House in the first part of the administration to get out of path to implementation, as Alex said, the Medicare transition plan. So I want to get a sense of, because we have seen a lot of debate in the last 6 months from obviously attacks from the right, but a lot of attacks from the left on her, that she is not sufficiently focused on Medicare for all, or that she is not moving to it. So I would love to get an assessment on that.
Yeah, just to rephrase the question is, what about the politics of Medicare for all, and is Elizabeth Warren a sellout for doing a two-part transition to Medicare for all?
Can I take a stab at that?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I do think there's a sellout there, but it's probably not the one you have in mind. If you look closely at her plan, it says deep within it that at the end of the day, provider income will not be changed, which means that the 17% of GDP that we spend on healthcare will not go down. And that's, I guess, her way of trying to buy off this provider colossus, right? Is saying, I know I look scary, but look at this paragraph right here. It says, at the end of the day, you're not going to lose any income. We're going to lower rates, but any increase in the efficiency of healthcare goes to the provider. Well, I'd like to see increases in the efficiency of healthcare come to the rest of us, right? Providers can have some of that, but not all of it. So, it's Don Berwick, I understand, that wrote that plan, and he is a doctor, and he made it so it's very good for doctors. Sadly, we got to take on these guys. Our doctors make twice as much money as doctors in France or Germany, and they're not any better, right? Contact with the U.S. healthcare system is the third leading cause of death in the United States, right? We're paying too much for healthcare. The price has to come down. And that means a lot of people that are providers in healthcare are going to have to get used to the idea of less income, right? And so what I'm really afraid of is that we pass this, we set up all these expectations. We're going to have Medicare for all, but we're secretly saying to the doctors, don't worry about a thing. You still can have your new Lexus. You still can have your McMansion. You can still be a doctorpreneur, right? Because we've set it up. And that's why I see Medicare for all devolving into corporate welfare if we're not careful.
Alex, why don't you take a...
So I think it's just all comes down to trust, and you look at a person's history and what they're doing. So we have, so I'm not as worried as you are about that. Obviously, I work here in D.C. They're going to try to do everything that you just laid out. They is the people who extract wealth from the system, when their entire business model is going to be destroyed completely. And Wall Street is going to take the biggest haircut that they ever have, maybe the first time, in 40 years. So is Elizabeth Warren a sellout is a sort of ridiculous question, but I understand what Marchin is saying. Absolutely not. There are two candidates who push Medicare for all in the Democratic primary. Now you have the Senate bill and the House bill, which is Medicare for all. Senator Elizabeth Warren, Senator Bernie Sanders are both on that. And then you do have their campaign plans. So I think that's where you can find a little bit of daylight. So it's just a short no to your second question. And then that the movement behind Medicare for all is the only way that we can actually ensure that it doesn't become just another way of profiting for Wall Street. So working with that movement in crafting what actually moves forward is critical.
Let's give our panel a round of applause. Thank you.
motion